Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum, everyone. So, on the behalf of Pakistan Endocrine Society, I welcome you all to the second day of the 19th PESCON 2021. I hope you all would be enjoying your stay in Islamabad and learning some wisdom pearls from the different endocrine sessions as well. So, I'm Dr. Shehla Tabassum. I'm Assistant Professor Endocrinology in Lahore. And the theme of our first session today is a very important one, that is the pituitary gland. So the pituitary gland is no larger than the size of a pea, but still it is called a master gland because it controls the function of a lot of other endocrine glands in the body. So it basically senses the needs of the body and then instructs the different organs and the endocrine glands to produce their hormones accordingly. So today we have got three very exciting talks lined up that are related to some unique aspects of this master gland. So I have the great honor of inviting my two senior colleagues to chair this session. First, I would like to invite Professor Dr. Tasneem Ahsan. Professor Dr. Tasneem is MRCP UK and has been awarded the fellowship of all the three Royal Colleges of UK and also the honorary FCPS by the CPSP. She retired from Jinnah Postgraduate Medical Center, Karachi in 2017 as Executive Director, Professor, and HOD of Medicine. She is one of the founding members of PES. She served as a member of Pakistan Medical Research Council, Advisory Board of Medicine, and as a Dean Secretary and Executive Member of the Faculty of Endocrinology at CPSP. She has published numerous endocrinology-related research articles in the various national and international journals. She has mentored several endocrinologists and currently heads the Medical Institute of Diabetes, Endocrinology, and Metabolism. Welcome, ma'am. So next, I would like to invite our second chair, Professor Dr. Rauf Niazi. Professor Dr. Rauf is FCPS Medicine, MRCP UK, and has been awarded fellowship of all the three Royal Colleges of UK, and has been awarded the fellowship of the American College of Medicine and Endocrinology as well. He is currently the Dean and the Head of Department of Medicine and Endocrinology at Pakistan Institute of Medical Sciences, Shaheed Zulfikar Ali Bhutto Medical University, Islamabad. Sir, kindly take the chair. So now I would like to request everyone, so please keep your mobile phones on the silent mode. And I would like to make a humble request to all the three next speakers as well. Kindly restrict their talks to 20 minutes so that the 5 minutes are left for the question and answer session as well. So each talk will be followed by a 5 minutes of question and answer session. So I would like to invite our first speaker, that is Dr. Umar Yusuf Raja. Dr. Umar is MRCP UK and FRCP London and is a consultant endocrinologist in Shifa International Hospital, Islamabad. He got trained from West Midlands Deanery in UK and later worked as consultant physician in endocrinology and diabetes at Warwick, UK as well. He has various research publications, abstracts, and posters published in various international journals as well as conferences. He will be talking on a very important topic, that is the pituitary apoplexy, storm in the making. Over to you, Dr. Umar.
Thank you, Shara. I hope my voice is clear. And thanks to the PES Scientific Committee, led by Professor Amir, to invite me on this very important topic, which is actually one of the endocrine emergencies. We have got very few endocrine emergencies, and of course, pituitary apoplexy is one that we are always vigilant about as an endocrinologist. And it's a mixed audience. We do have a pituitary surgeon as well, so it's always make it interesting. I'm going to start with these are my disclosures, and I'm going to start with a case presentation, because in that sort of encompass what we need to think about or how we need to manage a patient who presented with pituitary apoplexy. So this is a real case scenario. One of my patients that I saw in Warwick, 59-year-old South Asian gentleman, in fact, an Indian gentleman, he was watching football when he admitted with sudden onset dizziness, headache, and diplopia. And examination revealed partial third cranial palsy on the right side. So here's a past medical history of type 2 diabetes, hypertension, dyslipidemia, gout, and vitamin B12 deficiency. And you can see that he is on medication for the diabetes, blood pressure medications, vitamin B12 injections. So my slide changer is not working. Okay, fair enough. So here you can see on MRI pituitary shows a 1.5 centimeter by 1.7 centimeter circumcised mass within the right half of pituitary fossa, and there was a patchy heterogeneous contrast enhancements. And all his anterior pituitary function tests were normal. Specifically, I mean, look at the Schwarzenegger test. So basal cortisol level is 638 nanomoles per liter. These are UK units, and 30-minute cortisol level is 845 nanomoles per liter. Visual field examination was normal. And here you can see a picture of the pituitary. So there you can see the mass, you can see the opic chiasm on the right half of this MRI was taken a bit later, so you can't see the patchy contrast enhancement, but just to give you the feeling of the mass that you can see on the right half of the pituitary. So at this stage, I would like to vote on, if you are the admitting consultant, what will be your next step? So how many of you are going to refer to my friend here, Akbar Khan, the neurosurgeon? Just I need to have an idea, raise your hand, or no one is going to refer to. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And how many of you are going to wait and observe? And the rest will call a friend. Shall I put you on spot, given we have got a birthday boy? Ali, what are you going to do? Refer to neurosurgeon or wait and observe? Call a friend. I mean, there are, when you are going to manage a pituitary apoplexy, so you have to think about different questions. So the question to ponder are, okay, when we should be considering about pituitary apoplexy, if you're considering pituitary apoplexy, which investigations we need to consider, and then who should we refer to the neurosurgeon and who we can actually manage conservatively. And I'm going to go through those questions bit by bit. And Shaila, please, if there are 5 minutes left, let me know so that I can whiz away. So by definition, apoplexy is a sudden onset of headache, vomiting, visual impairment, third, fourth, and sixth nerve palsies, but can also present with meningism and altered consciousness due to hemorrhage or infarction of pituitary gland. So it is mostly present in 5th to 6th decade. There's a slight male preponderance, 1.6 male as compared to 1 female. And it was first described by Pierce Bailey in 1898. It was published in the Philadelphia Medical Journal. But the actual word apoplexy was coined by this paper. This is by Brougham, published in 1952 in Massachusetts, where they described 5 cases who presented pituitary apoplexy, and they coined the term apoplexy. So if you look at the natural history, the incidence is 4 to 20%. I mean, this review, I find it quite fascinating. It was published in Indian Journal of Endocrinology by Muthu Kumar. So if you look at the study by Fernandez, the incidence rate is 6.2 per 100,000 cases. But if you specifically look at incident in pituitary adenoma, then it is somewhere between 3 to 25%. And it varies based on the heterogeneity of these studies, whether you're looking at the non-secreting or secreting adenomas and different characteristics. But one of the largest studies is by Zhu, published in 2015, where they looked at more than 2,000 patients with pituitary adenoma and found an incidence rate of 4.8%. A UK-based study found an incidence of 7.9%. And again, the study by Fernandez Barsals, I mean, in 2011, actually mentioned that if you are going to only observe macroadenoma, so just you are managing them conservatively, then there will be a 1.1 events per 100 patients per year. So out of 100 patients per year, 1 will get a pituitary apoplexy. We knew that it's more common in non-functioning pituitary adenoma, followed by prorectinomas. So again, here you can see one of the surgical case series by Nielsen, where they look at 192 non-functioning adenoma and 21% present with apoplexy. It is 10 times more frequent in macroadenoma versus microadenoma. Again, this is a study by Zhu. And the Morer-Gode in 2011, I mean, what he commented was that it is 3 times more common in non-functioning adenoma versus secretly adenoma. So there are definitely some precipitating factors. Hypertension is the most common one, seen in 26% of cases. Major surgery, especially the coronary artery bypass, because of fluctuation in the blood supply to the brain, can lead to apoplexy. Dynamic pituitary function test, because that can slightly increase the size of pituitary tumor, can lead to apoplexy. And usually, if dynamic pituitary function test is the cause, then you will see apoplexy within 2 hours in 83% of the cases, and in all patients by 88 hours. So if you're doing a dynamic pituitary function test, you have to be slightly careful that they don't present with apoplexy. Anticoagulation, and in our current sort of Pakistani scenario, dengue, including dengue, so 3 times more likely to get pituitary apoplexy. Estrogen therapy and initiation of withdrawal of dopamine agonists, so they can increase slightly the size of pituitary gland, and hence can cause apoplexy. Radiation therapy, again in pregnancy, we knew pituitary increase in size. And finally, head trauma, lumbar puncture, spinal anesthesia. So if someone have got the pituitary apoplexy and have got those precipitating factors, do think about pituitary apoplexy if someone is presented with headache, especially with visual function deterioration. And there you can see the pathogenesis. So there are a number of things happening. So we knew that the pituitary tumors have got a high metabolic demand. So there's an increased glucose uptake, there's increased amino acid uptake, and also there's a reduced vascular endothelial growth factor, leading to reduced microvascular density as well as reduced angiogenesis. And that, in combination with increased intracellular pressure and precipitating factor, will lead to reduced perfusion and hence apoplexy. So it's one of the, you can say, theories behind pituitary apoplexy, not the only theory, by the way. So what about the clinical manifestation? I think it's important to notice that not all the patient will present with headache. So you can have silent apoplexy as well. So here you can see frequencies between 86 to 100%. The headache is sudden, severe, retroorbital, bifrontal, diffuse. There's associated vomiting in 40% of cases, along with nausea. Ocular paralysis is usually due to spread of the hemorrhage infarction in the pulmonary sinus, and can be seen in 25 to 70% of cases, and usually the third nerve, which is mostly affected in around 50% of cases. Visual disturbances, around 52 to 90% of cases, due to compression of optic chiasm, and ranges from bitemporal hemianopia to complete blindness. And then in some patients, they can present with meningism due to extravasation of blood or necrotic tissue into subarachnoid space, or even cerebral ischemia as well. So question number 1, again, these are the guidelines from the UK. When should we consider apoplexy? So the guidelines say, consider in all the patients who present with acute severe headache with or without neuroophthalmic signs. So it doesn't mean that they can have the visual field defects or reduced visual acuity. We've got certain headache, do consider it, especially if they have got pituitary tumor. So patient with a pituitary tumor, you have to advise them about signs and symptoms of apoplexy and guide them to come to hospital if that happened. Patient known to have a pituitary tumor must be observed for sign and symptom of pituitary apoplexy when performing pituitary stimulation test, or when you're commencing them on anticoagulation therapy or performing minor surgery. And then initial assessment should be done, of course, with a detailed history, focusing on symptoms of pituitary dysfunction, followed by a thorough physical examination, including the visual field confrontation. Now, you can notice that I put some tick mark. Tick mark is actually where this is a consensus opinion. It's an expert opinion. And the problem with pituitary apoplexy is it's an emergency, so you will hardly find a randomized control trial. So, I mean, here in those sort of basically 4C is more on some observational data. Most of them, the recommendation are on the consensus opinion. So that's answer to the question number 1. Okay, what about investigations? Now, we knew that around 70% of patients with pituitary apoplexy will have hypopit. ACTH is not the most common, but it's the most important. So ACTH deficiency will seen in 70%, gonadotrophin in around about 75%. So that's more common than ACTH deficiency, but I would argue this is the most important one, not to be missed. Thyrotropin deficiency in 50% and hyponatremia in 40%. But again, the methylcomposite, there's 16% patient with apoplexy, which will have normal pituitary function. So imaging, again, here you can see, so this is you can see the increased contrast there. So maybe a blood sort of basically happening there, large tumor, but MRI is of course imaging of choice, confirmed diagnosis in more than 90%. The problem is MRI is not available everywhere, and especially in casualty setting. So dedicated pituitary CT is the next best thing, most commonly used. Diagnosis can be made in 21 to 28% of cases, but cellular mass can be shown in 80% of cases. So the answer to question number 2, which investigations? Okay, we need to think about formal visual field assessment, preferably within 24 hours of the suspected diagnosis. You will do the baseline blood test and anterior pituitary profile, but specifically looking at random cortisol. If they are hemodynamically unstable, then take a blood sample for cortisol, free T4 and TSH, and then give them intravenous hydrocortisone. And that's the most important thing to do and not to miss. Urgent MRI must be done in all patients with suspected pituitary apoplexy to confirm the diagnosis, and a dedicated pituitary CT scan is indicated. MRI scan is either contraindicated or not possible. So what about management? Now, again, you can either think about managing them conservatively or surgical. Surgical, you force transsphenoidal resection, but conservative management include hormone replacement therapy, especially hydrocortisone, managing the electrolyte imbalance, closely monitoring of visual symptoms, including regular field monitoring, but it's all about teamwork. So if you are going to decide about the conservative management, you have to involve your neurosurgeon and you have to involve your ophthalmology. And then as a MDT team, you have to make that decision. Don't try to make that decision by yourself. Otherwise, you might be in big trouble. What was steroid replacement? As I mentioned earlier, acute secondary adrenal insufficiency can be seen in third of patient with apoplexy. Guidance say to give them hydrocortisone 100 to 200 milligram IV bolus, and then either you can set up an infusion, which very few centers I know even in UK tend to do them, or you can, and I find it much easier, you can give them 50 to 100 milligram intramuscularly every 6 months. Don't give them intravenously because there is some thoughts about maybe there might be difference in pharmacodynamics. So intravenous hydrocortisone every 6 hours might not be a suitable thing. Rather than intravenous hydrocortisone infusion or IM should be the choice. And you can give empiric steroid therapy again after withdrawing a blood for cortisol level in patients who have got hemodynamic instability, arterial conscious level, reduced visual acuity, and severe visual defects. And again, how do you characterize which patient to refer to my friend here, Akbar Khan, and which patient you can think about manage conservatory? And there are different grading system. So this is a grading system done by Gilitharan, where you can see different points being given based on the level of consciousness, visual acuity, visual field defects, and ocular paralysis. The lower the grading number is, you can refer them to the you can manage them conservatively. The higher the number, you can refer them for the surgery. And again, this is another graded technique by Joe, which divided into grade 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Grade 1 is asymptomatic with typical radiological finding. Grade 2, endocrinopathy with appropriate MRI finding with no other clinical symptoms. Grade 3, patient with headache. Grade 4, patient with ocular paralysis. And grade 5, patient visual defect or autosensorium. Higher the grade, you can refer them for surgery. What about head-to-head comparison? So we do have data. I mean, looking at the endocrine outcomes. So again, the latest study, if you see, or the newer study, say for this one by Gilitharan, though they found that 84% of their patients had anterior pituitary deficiency, but actually they found that there was same outcome in conservative versus surgical group. But the older study, so say this study by Willis, actually shows that if the patient underwent surgery within 3 days, they have better outcomes, but the numbers are quite small, 11 out of 18. Similarly, Chong in 2006 says there's a 3 times increase in need of hormone replacement in delayed surgery versus early surgery. So older surgeries are saying, older studies are saying surgical approach is better for conservation of pituitary function test. Newer studies are saying it's the same outcome. Visual outcome is where the things sort of matter, because Wu in 2010, I mean, his study mentioned there is 100% recovery if people can go surgery within 3 days in visual acuity versus 83% in those with surgery after 3 days, and similarly visual defect recovery 66% versus 40%. Look at Randeva, visual acuity recovery 100% within 8 days versus 43% in those with after 8 days. So visual acuity, visual defect 75 versus 23%. Ocular paralysis, again, it's the same outcome in both groups. So it seems like that if you have got visual acuity deficiency or you have got visual field defects, then maybe you need to call your neurosurgeon colleagues. But if it's only the hypopit or it's only the third or fourth or fifth cranial nerve palsy, you can actually wait and see. Because surgical management, I mean, it will come with its own risk as well. These are big tumors, the increased chance of CSF rhinorrhea. You can see transient diabetes incidence in 16% or up to 16%. Some of them will become permanent. And of course, some of your neurosurgeons might remove the whole pituitary gland as well. And if they are young, yes, there will be another headache for you as an endocrinologist. So again, then based on that, the guideline says, 5 minutes, I will finish. Patient with pituitary apoplexy who are without any neuroophthalmic sign or mild and stable sign can be considered for conservative management with careful monitoring. But if you've decided that, then you need to do the formal visual field assessment and acuity every day until there is clear trend of improvement. And that frequency can be changed, reduced to 4 to 6 hourly, or even if someone is acutely unwell, every hour if the patient deteriorates. When to refer for surgery? So yes, if they have got severe neuroophthalmic signs such as severe reduced visual acuity, severe and persistent or deteriorating visual field defect, or deteriorating level of consciousness.
If you manage them conservatively, it improves almost 100%. So that is one thing to consider. And the second thing I wanted to mention was, which I think I came across, I was trained in England and MD Anderson and whatever I was. But in Pakistan, I've come across another scenario, which I think we have a combined patient of that as well, an orthopedic surgeon, which I operated in the end. And that is a silent or delayed apoplexy. So patients have had apoplexy maybe 2-3 months ago. And then they present and then they've got a tumor, a large tumor, but actually there is blood inside it. It's very easy to operate on. I have to be very honest. You just go in and suddenly the blood gushes out. And then you realize he's got a chronic blood or 6-month-old blood or whatever. So I think that is something we need to look at and probably publish, looking at the MR scans, the silent or delayed apoplexy. And I think I would like to know that a very senior endocrinologist sitting here, that what is like, how many like patients that we come across, like recently, if I look at my last 6 months, I think I must have done at least 10 of those who had a large tumor looking, but inside there was only blood. So I think that is something we need to look at.
I mean, again, that's sort of business. So you're absolutely right. I mean, there is this concept of silent apoplexy as well. And I think a lot of us have seen patients who have got all the acromegalic features and there's no tumor at all. And some of us think that maybe there might be a pituitary apoplexy and it's an auto hypophysectomy. That's one thing. The other thing is that the problem in Pakistan is that they will automatically go to neurosurgeon. They will never come to us. And I think it's just to realize them that if a pituitary apoplexy, it's an endocrine emergency, so you can call us at 3 in the morning as well. I'm happy to take calls if it's apoplexy. There are very few things where as endocrinologists, we would come to the hospital. Otherwise, we can manage in the phone as well. So adrenal crisis, thyroid storm, pituitary apoplexy, DK. Yep, those 4. Rest, I would like to answer on my phone. So that's the problem. I think it's just because, and there's always, I mean, surgeon, I would say, will operate, to be honest. That's how you are trained. So that's the problem. So that's why you have to come via our route rather than via yours route. Any other questions?
Dr. Umar Yusuf Raja, I have a question.
Ji.
Your patient had cranial palsy, third nerve palsy, and obviously with associated comorbidities. Why did you think of operative procedure according to the criteria falling into grade 4?
So again,
why
yeah.
not operation? Because the
Yeah.
outcome would have been better.
Yeah, so the thing about sort of basically now, I mean, again, that was in Warwick, and we do have one of the person who was writing those guidelines were actually in Coventry, and we have the luxury of having a chat with him as well. There was no visual field defects that we can see. It was only a cranial palsy. Then they sent him, and I haven't mentioned random cortisol level. That's fine. So he was hemodynamically stable. There was no visual field defect. We didn't feel the need that we need to do the neurosurgery. Surgery and neurosurgery were more on that. So it was again an MDT. So that's why, I mean, that's when we were trained, now we were taught sort of basically, oh, every person with apoplexy should go to neurosurgeon. But then there was this paradigm shift in thinking that you don't need to send everyone for the pituitary surgery. So this is one of the cases where there are mild sinus symptoms, just only cranial nerve deficiency. And the data shows that these patients who have only cranial nerve deficiency, they resolve by themselves. If it's a visual field defect, if it's a reduction in visual acuity, yes, you have to send them. If it's only a cranial nerve palsy, even if they've got a hypopita as well, you can actually wait and see, because surgery will have got its own complications as well. So that was the reason for managing conservatively.
I wanted to add to Umar's surgical perspective on this is that Umar is right actually. That lesion, when you see, is just involving the right cavernous sinus. It's not even touching the optic chiasm. So if it's not touching the optic chiasm, I mean, in Pakistan, we work on telephone, as Umar was saying, like we'll discuss with each other, whatever. But the reality is that case does not need surgery and should not be operated upon. And because the visual field deficit will get better on its own, the cranial nerve deficit, because the patient does not have any visual field deficit. So I think I kind of agree with Umar on that.
I mean, you can see if you look at the data, the optic chiasm is just up there, and the pituitary, there is literally a gap of maybe from here to Karachi, I would say.
Any other question? Thank you so much, Dr. Umar, for such an elaborative talk and for such a good time management as well. There is a message. Yes. So there is a message from the conference management team. The candidates whose abstracts have been accepted for poster presentation, kindly display your posters in the designated area. Thank you. So next, I would like to invite our second speaker of the session, Professor Dr. Saeed Maher. Professor Dr. Saeed is FCPS Medicine and did fellowship in diabetes endocrinology and metabolism from Aga Khan University, Karachi, and has been awarded the fellowship of the Royal College of Physicians, London, UK, and the American College of Medicine and the American College of Endocrinology as well. He is currently the head of the endocrine services at National Institute of Cardiovascular Diseases, Karachi. He has published more than 30 articles in the peer-reviewed journals nationally and internationally. He is the past president of Pakistan Endocrine Society, and he is received the prestigious Lifetime Achievement Award in 2018 for his outstanding services to the Pakistan Endocrine Society and endocrinology in Pakistan as well. He was also the past president of the Pakistan chapter of American College of Endocrinology as well. He will be talking on a very important topic, that is a fine prints in prolactinomas, the special situations that we deal with while we are dealing with the prolactinomas. So over to Professor Dr. Saeed Maher.
Thank you, Dr. Sheila, for your kind introduction. So I will try to finish within time. So this is some of the most important thing or most important topic that we do see as an endocrinologist. Professor Akbar Khan most probably has left the hall. Like, and I think so that's the only tumor we endocrinologists treat, and majority of them we treat without any surgery. So without any further delay, if we look at the epidemiology of the prolactinomas, it's the most common pituitary adenoma, and roughly it's around 60 to 100 per million. Its prevalence is high, or it's more seen commonly in females in comparison to the males, and it's more common again in the age group of around 25 to 35. So it's mainly in the childbearing age group in the females. It's not only that we only do see the prolactinomas separately, but we do see hyperprolactinemia in association with actually some of the other endocrine problems like acromegaly and Cushing syndrome. This is what we have seen, the patients with dopamine agonist treated hyperprolactinemia in around the main age group is again, that's the 25 to 34 age group, and more commoner in women as compared to the men. This is not working, and that's the problem. Okay, What is the pathogenesis? So exactly, we don't know what exactly the mechanism of that hyperprolactinemia, but this is something which is being suggested that there is a decreased stimulation with the dopamine, and second one is actually the clonal somatic mutation on, and only there's no specific mutation have been identified except in multiple endocrine neoplasia M1 syndrome, which is also associated with the increased prevalence of prolactinoma. So these are actually the hypothesized the mechanisms of hyperprolactinemia in our patients. Causes, what actually causes the hyperprolactinemia? Multiple causes, but just I will emphasize on a couple of them for our practitioners, that the drugs are one of the most important cause of hyperprolactinemia. If someone is coming to you with the hyperprolactinemia, please have a careful history about the drugs, and majority of patients will fall into that group. The second important cause of hyperprolactinemia in our practices is actually the hypothyroidism. This is something which we do really see, that someone is coming with the hyperprolactinemia, and when you check them, turned out to be hypothyroid. To treat their hypothyroid, they are fine. Cirrhosis, chronic renal failure again. Then again, the pregnancy, exercise, chest wall stimulation, nipple stimulation, neoplastic, the causes, prolactinomas, acromegaly, cranopharyngioma. These are some of the other causes. So remember, one I will definitely will mention my teacher, Dr. Naeem Ulaq, who has given me the the incidence of that prolactinoma, that someone has referred him a case from the infertility clinic who has got high prolactin levels. When he checked his the pregnancy test, that was turned out to be positive. So think about the common things first, and then you look for the other things. How they present? Usually, because once the prolactin levels are high, that causes actually the hypogonadism. So hypogonadism, due to the inhibitory effects of the prolactin, is one of the commonest presentation in these patients. If they have got the macroprolactinoma, yes, then they have got the effect on actually the optic chiasma, or sometimes then they leads to the headache, visual disturbances, and cranial dysfunction. And if they are long standing, then definitely they can present with the anti-pituitary hormone deficiencies. If we divide them, that how they are being presented, though they are presented in 3 groups. One are the premenopausal women, menopausal women, and the men. So if I talk about the premenopausal women, usually they report early, because usually in females in this age group, usually if they have got the menstrual irregularities, they report early for these problems. So menstrual irregularities, hot flushes, decreased libido, infertility, galactorrhea, osteopenia, and osteoporosis are one of the presenting findings in this age group. Then if we look at the levels at the presentation, so usually prolactin levels more than 100, they cause hypogonadism, leading to amenorrhea, hot flushes, and the vaginal dryness. Prolactin levels between 50 and 100, amenorrhea, oligomenorrhea, and the prolactin level between 20 to 50 may cause only the infertility. So that's something which we always correlate clinically where your patient fits in. Postmenopausal women, as I said earlier, that usually in these patients, the galactorrhea is usually very rare, but usually as these patients may present late, so they have got the effects of the mass effects causing the headache, visual disturbance, and sometimes it may be an incidental finding when they are checked for some other things. In men, usually it presents late in the men. Usually they usually present as the macroprolactinoma, and how they present, majority of them present with a decreased libido and impotence. So this is again one of the message to this presentation, that someone who is coming to you with the erectile dysfunction, a male, please do check his prolactin levels. Definitely you will pick some of these cases when there is a problem with the hyperprolactinemia. They can present with the infertility, oligospermia, gynecomastia. Galactorrhea is rare in males, but yes, there are some cases in which there is galactorrhea in male also. And as I said earlier, usually they present late, though they have got the visual symptoms of headache and visual disturbances. Diagnosis, straight away, it's the prolactin level you need for the confirmation. So rule out the cause of elevated prolactin. As I said earlier, you have to look into what is the cause of increased prolactin level, and definitely pregnancy should always be ruled out in women of childbearing age. MRI is always recommended in with the contrast in these patients, and if you suspect there is the headache and other thing, then the visual field testing. If there is macroprolactinoma, definitely we do recommend that there should be the visual field testing in these patients. Whom we treat? Is it that everybody who is coming with hyperprolactinemia should be treated? Absolutely not. Then who are the patients who should be treated for hyperprolactinemia? Usually those that has got the macroadenoma, number one. Number two, enlarging macroadenoma. If you follow them, infertility, bothersome galactorrhea, gynecomastia, testosterone deficiency in male, oligospermia or amenorrhea. So these are some of the indications when we say that these patients should be treated when they have got hyperprolactinemia. What is the aim of the treatment? What do you want to get from the treatment? We get reduction of the prolactin levels and its clinical consequences, reduction of the tumor mass, that's relieving the pressure symptom, especially in macroprolactinoma. Then preservation of the pituitary function, prevention of continuing growth of the tumor, and improvement in the quality of life. So these are some of the aims that when we treat these patients. What are the treatment modalities? Number one, if there is microadenoma, there is no any bothersome symptoms, then usually you observe these patients. Then medically, the dopamine agonist or the treatment in these patients. Surgically, yes, if there is option of surgery, transsphenoidal surgery is one of the options. Then radiotherapy is also there to treat some of these patients. Medical treatment, as I said earlier, dopamine agonist or the treatment of choice in these patients. So these drugs inhibit the prolactin secretion and reduce the tumor volume by acting on the D2 dopamine receptors. So these are the initial drugs we usually use. The dopamine agonists which are available with us is actually bromocriptine, cabergoline, pergolide, lasuride, and quinabolide. But usually we know that usually these two, bromocriptine and cabergoline, are frequently used in these patients. How they are being used? Now, bromocriptine is usually given once a day, but the cabergoline is usually given once or twice a day. They have got their own side effects. We do look at them, but definitely the cabergoline is more tolerated in comparison to the bromocriptine. We know that cabergoline has a half-life, a greater half-life, and usually that's the reason its dose is usually once or twice weekly, and they have got the restoration of the fertility. Definitely it's better than the bromocriptine. So it's preferred in comparison to the bromocriptine in these patients. Follow-up, the periodic prolactin measurement. Usually when you start somebody on the treatment, usually you ask them to return by 4 to 6 weeks, and then you do the prolactin level. Someone who has got the macroprolactinoma, the tumor size is high, then usually you follow them with also the MRI, which usually being done in 3 months or 6 months, depending on the condition or your own assessment. So these are actually the follow-ups you need. When you discontinue the treatment, you do not treat these patients for whole of their life. So there are certain things when you think that we should discontinue, then the therapy may be tapered and discontinued in patients who have been treated for at least 2 years and who no longer have elevated serum prolactin level and no visible tumor or remnant on the MRI. Now these are the patients, then you think that yes, you can discontinue the treatment in these patients, and definitely it's not only that you only discontinue it, but these patients will need your follow-up. These follow-up should be on a regular basis, that they may rebound, they may come back, the prolactin may come back, so they definitely need the follow-up of these patients. Then there are certain definitely prolactinomas which are resistant, which are not usually being treated by the dopamine agonist, so we call them as resistant prolactinomas. So why we call them resistance? Resistance is defined as failure to achieve normal prolactin levels and inhibitory to induce tumor shrinkage by 50% with at least 6 months of optimal dopamine agonist therapy. So you can see that this is less with the cabergoline and more with the bromocriptine. So cabergoline is again better. Treatment options, then substitute with another dopamine agonist, increasing dose of dopamine, transsphenoidal surgery, or the another drug, what I'm going to explain is the temozolomide. Surgery, when you send the patient for the surgery, this is again something whenever we send these patients if they need it. When there's increasing tumor size despite the medical therapy, there's pituitary apoplexy, beautifully presented by the Omar. Then dopamine agonist therapy resistance macroadenoma, dopamine agonist resistant microadenoma in a worsening patient seeking fertility, persistent chiasmal compression. When you see that it's compressing continuously, and this is something when you need for the surgery, medically unresponsive cystic prolactinomas, women seeking fertility, macroadenomas in close proximity to optic chiasma, CSF leak with medical therapy, and when dopamine agonist is contraindicated, very few in psychiatric patients when they actually being worsened when you put them on dopamine agonist. So these are some of the indications when you send your patient for the surgery. Transsphenoidal surgery is the surgery of choice in these patients. Surgery outcomes: normalization of the prolactin levels in microadenoma 70 to 90%, macro 30 to 80%. Recurrence rate is approximately same in both the groups. Malignant prolactinomas, yes, these prolactinomas that exhibit metastasis spread with or outside the central nervous system, temozolomide can be a therapy which can be used or tried in these patients. Again, temozolomide is again used as a last resort for aggressive invasive tumors refractory to other medical conditions. So this is something which we are using in some of the resistant or refractory prolactinomas. Radiation treatment, when we consider the radiation treatment has a limited role definitely in these prolactinomas. Following conventional XRT, prolactin levels normalize in approximately 25% of the patient. Major complication, that patient will become hypopet. So definitely majority, as I said earlier, is in the females. We do not make that our females usually in the childbearing age will become hypopet, but this is something which is there and you can choose accordingly the situation of your patients. Pregnancy, one of the again something which we do see, this something which is tricky, that in pregnancy usually the prolactin levels increases. If you look at that, non-pregnant first trimester, second trimester, and third trimester, when usually the prolactin levels become high in these patients. Again, same due to the serum prolactin concentration increase during the pregnancy. This is what we have depicted earlier. And prolactinomas in pregnancy, definitely their size increases. This is something we all know, that the size increase in pregnancy, and some of these patients with macroadenoma exhibit a symptomatic increase in size during the pregnancy. And during the pregnancy, important things that especially with the macroprolactinomas of the headache and changes in the vision with every trimester. This should be a normal routine that these patients should be followed in every trimester with the symptomatic confirmation of the vision and all these things. Prolactin level are not usually very helpful because I said earlier, the prolactin level will be high. So definitely in macroprolactinomas, usually it's your clinical judgment. Visual field testing, yes, that should be done every 3 months in women when the tumor is extending to supracellular region, and when the report visual changes, then MRI, but without contrast. This is important, that MRI without contrast is an option in pregnancy with us. If the tumor enlargement is seen causing visual field defects, then dopamine agonist treatment should be reinstituted. Usually we say that once the patient is pregnant, to discontinue the dopamine agonist treatment, but if it should be when the tumor is causing visual field defect, then it should be reinstated and should be continued throughout the pregnancy. Transsphenoidal surgery is reserved for women who do not respond to these, and if the surgery should be done, then probably the second trimester is the the safest period in which then they can go for the surgery. Cabergoline is preferred in pregnancy, but bromocriptine is really a choice when they can use. So if I summarize it, that when the pregnancy is confirmed, that is microprolactinoma, we withdraw the dopamine agonist when pregnancy is concerned. and a clinical assessment in each trimester, attention paid to the headache and visual impairment. If negative findings, continue the repeated assessment in each trimester. And if the positive findings, yes, cell MRI, but without contrast. Then evidence of tumor expansion, definitely we introduce the dopamine agonist in these patients. And if unsuccessful, then consider the neurosurgery or delivery more than 37 weeks of gestation. On the second side, if they have got the macroprolactinoma, yes, when they are extending macroprolactinoma, then definitely you individualize the case. That's up to, it's better than this. These cases should be referred to the proper endocrinologist for their proper management. And again, as I said earlier, previously, when involved there is macroprolactinoma, then definitely, as I said earlier, you can reintroduce the dopamine agonist in these patients. And if there is, usually you follow these patients in each trimester with actually, if they have got vision problems, definitely visual fields is the most important thing you do. If you can suspect the expansion, definitely again, the MRI with the contrast is the treatment of choice in these patients. So as I said earlier, MRI without contrast, evidence of tumor expansion, definitely reintroduce the dopamine agonist, and it's not the improving, then consider the neurosurgery or delivery if more than 37 weeks of gestation. Thank you very much for your attention. I think I'm within time.
Yes. So the forum is open for question and answers.
No questions.
Dr. Saeed Meher, can I start?
Yeah, ma'am, sure.
So I just want to ask you about your experience with the prolactinoma co-secreting growth hormone, because we've had some cases. So I was just wondering what is your experience of?
Definitely, absolutely agree, madam. These are some of the cases which are also shown in my initial slide, that there's some of the pituitary tumors when they are co-secretors. Definitely in these patients also, before sending them for any surgery, we introduce these patients with the dopamine agonist, and that dopamine agonist in these patients will really help in shrinking of the tumor size and better outcomes when the surgery is being done in these patients.
The only surprise is when you've treated prolactinoma, and for all intents and purposes in the initial workup, it was just an uncomplicated prolactinoma, and the patient goes away and returns several years later from some part of Pakistan, and now they've got full-blown acromegaly, which was not there initially. So I think this is a pertinent thing to remember. The other is a comment, which is, I'm sure all endocrinologists here will bear me out. Some of the most horrendous prolactinomas that we see are in men, and the men don't present to doctors early, which is a worldwide phenomenon. But even when they do, they kind of hedge around the issue of sexuality and sexual dysfunction. And as we are going to be more and more females in endocrinology now, I urge my women fellow endocrinologists to seek and actively question men for their sexual function, and we may be helping the men this way.
Absolutely agree, ma'am.
Sorry? No, we can do everything that you can do, and we can do it better. So we're not referring to you.
Thank you, sir. I'm Dr. Nawaz. Sir, one question. I searched but not found a proper answer. But what is the dose up for the resistant prolactinoma, and for how much duration we can use it? Then we call it as resistant for both for bromocriptine and for cabergoline.
Usually for the cabergoline, usually you can give up to 4 to 5 milligram, or maybe higher than that. But usually you use it for at least 6 months. When you see it's not responding, as shown in my slide also, the tumor is not shrinking to less than 50%, then you can label them as the resistant prolactinomas. Then you consider the other options for these patients. 4 to 5 milligrams. You can go up to the 5 milligrams per week.
Sir, Assalamu alaikum, sir. मुझे डॉक्टर मोहम्मद अरशद कहते हैं सर। सर पूछना ये था कि बोमाकेप्टाइन आपने कहा कि 24 आवर्स इसका ड्यूरेशन है, तो आपने कहा ट्वाइस डेली दे सकते हैं सर। सर जब उसका 24 आवर्स है तो हम उसको ट्वाइस डेली क्यों दें
That
पेशेंट पे?
depends. Yeah, absolutely agree. You can give it once a day also. That depends. Once a day, you can start with the once a day, but sometimes these patients has got the side effects of these. So sometimes when you escalate the dose, you can divide the dose into two. But yes, absolutely agree. You can give it once a day also.
This is a recommendation, yes, evidence purpose.
This is again your own clinical practices, how you individualize your patients. As I said earlier, in cabergoline, for example, the cabergoline is recommended that ideally should be given once a week. But when you escalate the dose, then you usually we give cabergoline also twice a week in some of these patients. So you individualize your patients.
अगर प्रेगनेंसी के अंदर प्रोलेक्टिमा है कि हम उसको रेडियोथेरेपी दे सकते हैं?
वो भी मैंने अपनी प्रेजेंटेशन में बताया कि उसकी भी कुछ खास इंडिकेशंस हैं जिसमें आप रेडियोथेरेपी, लेकिन मेरा ख्याल है कि प्रेगनेंसी के दौरान रेडियोथेरेपी नहीं देनी चाहिए. This is something which is again not good for the fetus also. It's better to not do it. The other options are available with us during the pregnancy in these patients.
And contraindication है सर?
Pregnancy में नहीं देनी चाहिए. Yep.
देनी चाहिए नहीं देनी चाहिए?
नहीं देनी चाहिए.
नहीं देनी चाहिए.
Dr. Said Bhai,
Yes, sir.
very wonderful presentation and very articulate to the point. When talking about dopamine resistant prolactinomas, one has to keep in mind, I'm sure you're going to elaborate on that, the dose of cabergoline. Obviously, larger doses we know cause valvular fibrosis.
Agree.
So you don't want to go to very high doses. And you're looking at prolactin levels. And obviously, rarely do we do MRIs to look at the size. In macro, yes, we do. In micro, we are looking at prolactin levels. If they do not respond, less than obviously 50% reduction in prolactin after 3 to 4 months on an optimal dose, which I would not exceed 3 milligram. I would seek opinion of my senior colleagues on that, but 3 milligram is quite a dose. And if you persistently give that dose, we're risking cardiac valvular fibrosis. So that would be really a fair cutoff point where we can think it's dopamine resistant prolactinoma and think about other modalities. So that's a comment and question as well.
Assalamu alaikum.
सर वो उमर बात करना चाह रहा है, मैं इसलिए I want to give it to Umar. Exactly.
Assalamu alaikum. My name is Dr. Shakur. I'm one of the endocrinologists at the Indus Hospital, Karachi. I would just like to want to take your opinion and your practice we have seen so many raised prolactin levels. The patients are coming with different symptoms, like PCOS and, for example, other fertility issues. And there are different numbers, which always makes people in trouble, numbers of the prolactins. So do you think that any prolactin level which is high has to be investigated for an MRI? Because, MRI is very costly investigation, things like that. Obviously, we need to exclude the other reasons for hyperprolactinemia, but looking at the investigations which are quite costly, like MRI, it's not available every time, everywhere. So what would be your recommendations and your sharing your experience that when the physician or endocrinologist should consider now this is the time to investigate more and go ahead with the next step?
Okay, I think so. I've given that answer in my talk also, but I'm repeating it again. That's again on your experience. The prolactin levels usually less than 100 are usually maybe due to some drugs, some other things. In these patients, it's better to wait some time, maybe 2 weeks, 3 weeks. You take a history. If some patient is on some drugs, you discontinue that drug and repeat the prolactin level and ask them to come back. Because we are not a fooding country. So I will usually ask these patients if the prolactin level is less than 100. But yes, if the prolactin level is more than 100, and usually the history is not very significant, they've got the issues of amenorrhea, infertility, then definitely I will ask these patients to have the MRI at the baseline. But if the prolactin level is less than 100, yes, you can wait for some time, maybe 2 weeks, 3 weeks. If they have got the history of drugs and other things, you discontinue the drug and repeat the prolactin is still high, then definitely you'll go with the MRI in these patients.
Excuse me, I am Dr. Mohammad Isaaq Paracha. My question is to Dr. Meher.
I can't see you.
Yes, we can. Okay. This.
You have given a list of drugs causing prolactinoma. Which specific antihypertensive group is notorious for that? Antihypertensive group. Antihypertensive group you have given in your list.
I don't remember exactly the specific any antihypertensive. If Umar can comment on that. Usually majority is the antipsychotic drugs.
You mentioned SSRI and also antihypertensive as well.
Calcium channel blockers might be, but they are not as notorious as the SSRIs or the metoclopramide like these drugs. But the putting that slide or that into that, there are certain drugs which cause. So if you have got any doubt about these, you always switch that the drug and reassess the patient for 6 weeks. But usually, again, I'm repeating the same thing that usually with the drugs, the prolactin level is not very high as compared to the other causes which we do see with these patients.
So Dr. Said, generally it's CCBs and methyl.
Calcium channel blockers, exactly.
So any question left?
Actually, just to comment, there's a new drug which is circulating in the gastroenterology community, which is producing tumor range of prolactin levels, levosulfuride. It's just all over the place.
Yeah, exactly.
And prolactins of more than 2. So it is the new Maxilon of today, because previously it used to be Maxilon. And
yeah, she's absolutely right. Absolutely right.
Yeah.
Amir.
Thank you. Excellent talk, Said. Just a comment.
Yeah.
I think there is a meta-analysis on this fibrosis, and that meta-analysis I don't recall, but that has shown that it's not to worry too much about it, as Umar has mentioned. I would refer that later on. And I think the 3 milligrams, somehow I feel comfortable with that. More than that, I'm a bit worried about using it. Just a comment. This is a personal experience. More than that, the intoleration, both with bromocriptine, there was a question. It's just a comment. That's why you give a smaller dose, because they become very intolerant. And when they become intolerant, they lose the confidence. So you have to give a smaller dose and build it up. Thank you.
Thank you.
So thank you, Dr. Yachame, for being as old as I am and agreeing with 3 milligrams.
Thank you so much, Professor Dr. Saeed Meher, for such a wonderful talk and such a good time management as well. So now I would like to invite our third and the last speaker of the session, that is Professor Dr. Najmul Islam. He is a consultant endocrinologist and professor of endocrinology at Aga Khan University, Karachi. He's one of the founding members of Pakistan Endocrine Society and has been its past president as well. He played vital role in getting the endocrinology subspecialty training recognized by CPSP and formulated its curriculum as well. Because of his extensive contributions towards the Pakistan Endocrine Society, he has been awarded with Lifetime Achievement Award as well. As the theme of this session is pituitary, the master gland. So he is the master endocrinology mentor. Many of the people are sitting over here are his trainees and now the highly skilled endocrinologists. So I am one of his proud trainees as well. So he will be giving a talk on growth hormone in adults, the beginning of a new life. Over to you, sir.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Mask उतार लो, अच्छा ठीक है. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum. कौन सी ये वाली है ना ऊपर? Thank you, Shaila, for your kind introduction. The title of my talk, which was given to me, was Growth Hormone in Adults, Beginning of a New Life. So without wasting any time, I'll start my presentation. Okay, so first, a historical review of the subject. In 1922, Evans and Long injected the beef extrapituitary extract into animals and reported excessive growth. And then the first result of the children receiving growth hormone was published in 1932. Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease was deadly complication of growth hormone therapy obtained from human pituitary, resulting in death of patients. And then the first case report of growth hormone administration in adult was in 1962, when a 35-year-old woman was treated for 2 months and responded with increased vigor, ambition, and sense of well-being. In 1979, a commercial company, Genentech, decided to produce growth hormone by genetic engineering. And from around 1985 onwards, the pharmaceutical companies started manufacturing this recombinant growth hormone. You're all familiar with growth hormone physiology. In addition to the accelerated growth, it has multiple actions in the body, which I'm not going to go in detail now because the deficiency symptoms will take care of it. So this is how the growth hormone is secreted in our body. It is during the night in the form of pulses, and this is in males and that is in females. This is what sort of response. So just a revision for most of you. The total amount of growth hormone and the temporal distribution of growth hormone release are strongly dependent on age. So here, if you see in the children, the growth hormone release is much higher. And as we grow older, the levels go down of growth hormone slowly with time. What is the prevalence of adult growth hormone deficiency? About 6,000 cases of adult growth hormone deficiency are reported each year in the United States, and a total of 50,000 diagnosed adults with adult growth hormone deficiency. It has been estimated to affect 1 in 100,000 patients annually. In European reports, it occurs an annual incidence of about 12 to 19 cases per million, and 15 to 20% of these cases are the children who are transited from childhood growth hormone deficiency into adulthood. And the clinical features of adult growth hormone really is a constellation of many symptoms: decreased lean body mass, decreased bone mineral density, decreased physical performance, decreased cardiac capacity, increased central fat deposition, increased glucose intolerance, dyslipidemia, increased intima thickness, and increased psychological issues, which I'm going to discuss a little bit in later slides. First thing, the central fat deposition is increased. Even in children, this phenomena is seen. Decreased lean body mass is there, and overall, because of this decreased lean body mass, the physical performance is decreased. So this is something, a well-known symptom of and sign of growth hormone, adult growth hormone deficiency. And in this slide, all studies show decrease in body fat with growth hormone replacement. This is the different studies and the percentage decrease, and the maximum decrease was in visceral fat when growth hormone was administered to patients with adult growth hormone deficiency. So growth hormone deficiency, therapy of growth hormone deficient offers significant clinical benefits in body composition and effect of growth hormone on visceral fat, and occurs within 6 months after the initiation of the therapy. A meta-analysis of 37 blinded randomized control studies found an overall beneficial effect of growth hormone on LDL cholesterol and total cholesterol profiles, however, did not show a consistent benefit on HDL and triglyceride levels. So the cardiovascular risk markers and adult growth hormone deficiency, we have already discussed visceral fat, which is increased, and growth hormone replacement reduces these visceral fat, carotid and intermedia thickness. Serum markers of cardiovascular risk is also decreased on growth hormone replacement like CRP, interleukin, serum amyloid, homocysteine, and so on and so forth. And coming on to the bones, decreased bone mineral density, I've already showed you in the initial slide, and this study showed that patients who had received growth hormone, the odds ratio for a fracture for not receiving it was 3.4. So it has an effect really on decreasing the fracture by increasing the bone mineral density. And this is shown here that in these two arms, the one arm is the one which without with growth hormone, and this is without, this is with placebo, and this is the percentage increase from baseline of the. So this shows that it works really in terms of improving the bone mineral density. So growth hormone therapy of growth hormone deficient adult offers significant clinical benefit in skeletal integrity. Growth hormone replacement eventual overall anabolic effects, but the increase in bone mineral density is only after 18 to 24 months of therapy, and most studies have shown increase of about 4 to 10% in BMD, generally greater on the vertebral than the femoral sides. So summary of the growth hormone replacement in adults on the bone and bone markers, 5% mostly on the lumbar spine, 2.5% on the femoral neck, increased BMD, no change in proximal radius, increased bone turnover markers. The remaining question is gender difference. Women show less response in terms of bone mineral density improvement, and combination with other agents further increase with bisphosphonate this has to be. And fracture rates, though I've shown you, but there are not many studies on the fracture rates. This is an important clinical feature of adult growth hormone deficiency, the psychological issues, which includes the low self-esteem, depression, mental fatigue, poor memory, impaired cognition, social isolation, dissatisfaction with body image. This is a quality of life is diminished in patients with growth hormone deficiency. And patients, again, the same thing in low energy levels, emotional lability, reduced vitality and fatigue, social isolation, depression, mental fatigue. So all these symptoms, they are pretty vague symptoms, but they are recognized symptoms of adult growth hormone deficiency. And this is one of the questionnaires that you have to use in patients with adult growth hormone deficiency before you start them on treatment. And there are so many questions that you have to ask them, and the answers of that will tell you whether they have a quality of life issue or not. And if they have quality of life issue, then that is one of the reasons for starting growth hormone replacement. Quality of life evaluation in patients have shown a high degree of variability. The degree of improvement in quality of life is generally proportional to the deviation from normality at the outset, but it shows no correlation with the degree of improvement in IGF levels. So it does not correlate with the IGF levels when you replace them. In practice, this means that if the quality of life of the patient is normal at baseline, no improvement will be seen with growth hormone replacement. Okay, so now after telling you about the clinical features of adult growth hormone deficiency, I'm going to the causes of growth hormone deficiency in adults. Tumors in the pituitary and hypothalamic regions, infiltrative diseases in that same region, surgery of the pituitary will lead to adult growth hormone deficiency. Cranial irradiation. Childhood onset growth hormone deficiency, when it when it goes to adulthood, if it's an idiopathic variety, or it could be following an organic lesion in childhood. And this is something important to note. Trauma, head trauma is also one of the recognized causes for adult growth hormone deficiency. And apoplexy, which Umar has discussed today, is also one of the reasons for growth hormone deficiency, and Sheehan syndrome as well. So again, if in childhood, children with growth hormone deficiency transitioning to adulthood, the childhood growth hormone deficiency is further divided into those with organic causes, and those are idiopathic. It is the idiopathic variety which may not show growth hormone deficiency in adulthood. But if they have an organic reason for growth hormone deficiency in childhood, they are likely to be deficient in adulthood as well. And again, growth hormone acquired during adulthood, we have discussed all that. So use of growth hormone in adults, when should we offer them? First of the growth hormone is usually the first anterior pituitary hormone to be affected by pathological lesions. For example, if there is a pituitary tumor, the first hormone to go usually is gonadotropins or growth hormone. Consequently, in a patient with multiple pituitary hormone deficiency, the probability of growth hormone is extremely high. No studies documenting that a transition from isolated idiopathic growth hormone to multiple pituitary hormone deficiency have been reported so far. Identifying growth hormone in adults can be difficult due to similarities with normal aging. Due to lack of specific biomarkers for growth hormone deficiency, provocative biochemical testing is required to diagnose adult growth hormone testing with adequate accuracy, but currently available tests are complex and may have significant side effects. Okay, so when to consider? Signs and symptoms are non-specific but common. No pathognomic features such as limited growth in children. That is very clear in children, but nothing like that in adults. Testing is conducted when there is an intention to treat. Don't start testing just for the sake of testing, because there's no point. No need to just to check and see. Who to test? Children diagnosed with growth hormone deficiency after reaching adult height, unless because of a structural or a genetic cause. That group will not need retesting. Adults with evidence of hypothalamic pituitary disease, they are the ones who should be offered the testing. Cranial irradiation or tumor treatment, or a traumatic brain injury. These are the major reasons for checking for doing provocative testings for growth hormone deficiency. And this is a slide showing multiple pituitary hormone deficits. So if you've got no pituitary hormone deficiency, and as you progress, the chances of growth hormone deficiency increases with multiple hormone deficiency. If you've got 3 hormone deficiencies, the likelihood is up to 96% having growth hormone deficiency as well. So intention to treat, patient selection, and we have stimulation test. We have got 3 available options: insulin tolerance test, glucagon stimulation test, and massimorelin stimulation test. This is by Sholmo Melmed from one of his article, and he has mentioned about 4 tests, but this test, the growth hormone releasing hormone and arginine, is no more available and done now because the growth hormone releasing hormone is not manufactured in USA anymore. So that test is out. So we're left with insulin tolerance test, glucagon, and this is a massimorelin, the ghrelin receptor agonist. Insulin tolerance test is still considered the gold standard diagnostic test for growth hormone deficiency and should be considered as the initial test unless there are contraindications to its use. And we know that it is contraindication in patients with ischemic heart disease, with those who have got epilepsy. So these are the contraindications. Because it induces heart rate contraindications with coronary artery disease, seizures, and NSAID. The combination of growth hormone with arginine was endorsed by several consensus guidelines as a comparable, accurate alternative to UTI, especially when ITT is contraindicated. But as I told you, it has been discontinued because of the growth hormone, releasing hormone not being available. Several studies have shown the glucagon stimulation test is reliable as ITT in discriminating growth hormone deficient and normal adults. A cutoff of 3 defines a severe growth hormone deficiency. We're talking about glucagon stimulation test, whereas if a cutoff of 5 defines growth hormone deficiency, a balance between high sensitivity and high specificity can be achieved with a cutoff of 5.1. And this is something that we need to know when we're doing a glucagon stimulation test. That if the BMI is more than 30, you need to go use a higher dose, 1.5. And if the BMI less than 30, you need to use 1 milligram. Original protocol and results gave no standardization cutoff based on weight, but this has been subsequently modified. This is massimorelin, a diagnostic test, which is a ghrelin analog. This is a study in which this trial validating the use of massimorelin against ITT for the diagnosis of growth hormone deficiency. Multi-center study, 38. These are the group of patients matched to controls. Pre-established cutoff points of 5.1 for ITT and 2.8 for massimorelin was used in this study. And the conclusion of this study was highly correlated to ITT, higher peaks noted than ITT, recently approved for use in growth hormone deficiency testing agents. Interesting finding, increasing the cutoff point to 5.1 improved the sensitivity from 87 to 92% without losing specificity. This is an oral test, by the way, as compared to the ITT and glucagon, which are parenteral. So this is these 3 tests which we have at our disposal. Insulin tolerance is the gold standard. It's not safe, not very well tolerated because of the hypoglycemic symptoms. It's not simple, it's not speedy, it's reliable and available. Glucagon, again, accurate, not the gold standard, but the BMI cutoff has to be taken care of. And this is that. Massimorelin is yes everywhere, but this is a costly test. Even in US, as compared to other one, the cost is much higher for this test. And the same thing is shown by the clinical practice guidelines, endocrine practice of 2019. The same thing has been shown. The previous one was by a Korean author. So this is an algorithm for testing for growth hormone patients with a suspicion of growth hormone deficiency. So adult patients with organic growth hormone deficiency, if more than 3 hormone deficient, no further testing with a low IGF-1. So if somebody has got 3 pituitary hormone deficiency and a low IGF-1, no further testing is required in that group. If there is organic lesions in the pituitary gland and 1 or 2, then you have to do, and a low IGF, you have to do further testing, which is from any of these tests. And if there is a history of hypothalamic diseases and all that, a high suspicion with the low IGF-1, you have to do it. And if there is a low suspicion and with the normal IGF-1, despite the history of the pituitary lesions and or a treatment in that region, you don't go further on that. And for the interpretation of the glucagon stimulation test, you need to be aware that the cutoffs are different for patients with BMI less than 30 and those who have got BMI more than 30. And this is for patients with clinical suspicion, transition from childhood growth hormone deficiency. So if they have congenital defects, genetic defects, and organic disease, and greater than 3 hormone deficiencies or a low IGF-1, no further testing is required in this group. Again, the same thing applies, which I had shown in previous slides, and rest of them are more or less similar to the previous slides. Growth hormone replacement. So once we have decided the right patient to be replaced, we need to know the dosage. One of the studies, this is a comparison with the children. The starting dose of children is different than what we are starting in adults. For those who are less than 60, 0.2 to 0.4. and for those who are more than 60 years of age, 0.1 to 0.2. Again, this is one of the, and this is from the Pichri guideline of 2019, published in Endocrine Practice. They say individual patient characteristics has to be taken into consideration, and they say that if the age is less than 30, you start them on a higher dose, 0.4 to 0.5 milligrams per day, and maybe higher for patients transitioning from the pediatric treatment. So we are talking about this sort of a dose in young people, and those who are between 30 to 60 years, 0.2 to 0.3 milligrams per day, and if greater than 60, 0.1 to 0.2. In transient patients, we recommend resume growth hormone at 50% of their childhood dose. So that can also be used. And in patients with concurrent diabetes, obesity, starting with the low dose is recommended, these group of patients. And factors that may affect change in growth hormone dosing. When we are treating it, if your patient, young patients will need higher doses, low serum IGF levels, we need to increase the dose. But if you add oral estrogens, the dose has to be increased. And if you change from transdermal to oral estrogens, the dose has to be increased as well. And these are the conditions where the doses may be decreased, the elderly and those who have got high serum IGF levels while you are monitoring the case. So use of growth hormone in adults for how much to be titrated at IGF levels can be maintained mid-normal to below the upper limit of normal, and the dose should be reduced if its side effects manifest. So the target is IGF mid-range or slightly below the upper end of the normal. That is the range that you would like to keep. Side effects of growth hormone replacement at the recommended doses manifest in about 20% of the patients and are usually reversible by reducing the dose or stopping growth hormone treatment. Reported side effects include fluid retention, arthralgia, myalgia, paresthesia, carpal tunnel, sleep apnea, sleep disturbances, and dyspnea. But some of these symptoms may settle just continuing the treatment, and some may settle by decreasing the dose of growth hormone. Occasional worsening of diabetes have been reported. So that has to be managed, or the other option is to reduce the dose of growth hormone. The parameters to be monitored in adults with growth hormone on recombinant growth hormone replacement. This is the metabolic variables which has to be studied before the start of treatment. Quality of life questionnaire has to be filled, and IGF-1 has to be done. And this has to be followed while you are giving patients your growth hormone replacement. Although the development of new cancers and new onset diabetes is of concern, the safety profile of growth hormone treatment appears favorable in long-term surveillance studies. Growth hormone does not appear to increase the rate of prime pituitary adenoma recurrence. So we are pretty really safe in this on this side. How long? The duration of treatment of adult growth hormone has not been defined. If therapy is tolerated with a good clinical response to treatment, then there is no particular reason to discontinue treatment, means lifelong. Conversely, if there is no perceived or biochemical benefit of treatment after at least 1 year of therapy, then consider stopping the growth hormone replacement therapy. So again, the same thing, it depends indefinitely. If no apparent reason, stop it in 12 to 18 months. Why? So last part of my presentation is why there is an interest to consider long-acting growth hormone preparation. We ease the burden of chronic daily injections, improve patient adherence, improve quality of life, and potentially improve clinical outcomes because we are going to use in more patients. And there are various methodologies that have been adopted in developing this long-acting growth hormone. Depot preparation, pegylated formulations, non-covalent binding. These are the various methodology. I'm not going to spend time on that, but just to show that we have certain of them marketed in the world at the moment. This Utropin Plus is available. It's given once a week and marketed in Korea for chronic growth hormone replacement. Then we have this Gentro Long, again, one of the long-acting growth hormone preparation. marketed in China for chronic growth hormone deficiency replacement. And this is Sobroa, which is again approved by FDA in August 2020 for use in adult growth hormone deficiency, but not marketed as yet. And this is the last, the stall that I told you about US approval. This was a study in which they compared with the once a day, this is once a day injection of growth hormone versus once weekly. And this shows that difference in treatment satisfaction scores was much more towards the once a day, once a week preparation. So in conclusion, adult growth hormone is mostly caused by hypothalamic pituitary disorders and their treatment by surgery, radiation. Replacement of growth hormone in patients with adult growth hormone is beneficial and safety demonstrated in long-term surveillance trials. Provocation testing is required in most cases to establish growth hormone deficiency. Diagnostic testing has become easier with massimorelin. Initiation and titration is an important part of replacement of growth hormone in adults. Side effects are rare and transient and reversed by growth hormone, lowering of the growth hormone dose. Duration of growth hormone has not been defined, but generally for an indefinite period. And long-acting growth hormone preparations are being developed and marketed and may prove to be more convenient and may replace daily growth hormone replacement in the future. And more research is required in this patient population. By the way, last thing before I conclude is that the cost in Pakistan for the doses that we are talking about will vary anything between rupees 7,000 to rupees 21,000 per month, because the dose is much lower than the dose that we use in children. Thank you.
So the forum is open for any questions. So there is a question toward that side.
Please, can somebody give the mic to them so that I can hear their question? Yeah, पहले खुर्शीद पूछ ले आपके पास है, just इनको दे दो पहले, just let him finish and then.
Thank you very much for an excellent presentation. But I believe anytime we talk about growth hormone, especially in adults, it generates more controversy than consensus. And unfortunately, the reason I'm making this comment because there are a lot of fellows here as well. So for them also to know, in some cities, in some areas in Pakistan, we know there are some doctors and they are prescribing growth hormone left and right for people for quality of life parameters, so you will feel better, your cognition will be better. And what they're doing is they're just doing the growth hormone level, just a random level, and tell the patients, okay, this is low. So that's something which is a pitfall, which is a malpractice people need to be aware of. So having made that comment, the second point is replacement in adults as far as the growth hormone deficiency goes. And I would like your take on this, because let me give you my perspective, because very rarely that we need growth hormone replacement in adults. Most of those adults, they do fine, and very rarely we need the testing unless someone has craniopharyngioma, was operated on, and those are the people where even when they transition from childhood to adult age, they do need some growth hormone. But otherwise, most of the kids even who are deficient, when you reevaluate them after puberty, after their maximum height is achieved, not many of them actually require that. And that's something which I can tell you in my training in US, and then later on I worked as part of faculty there, there was something very rarely used, rather I would say was frowned upon. If someone is using and really had to be scrutinized, really this patient needed that. I recall a case where an adult patient came in and was so dysfunctional in terms of everyday living, and then the trial was given and was found out, yes, she did fine after that, and that was continued. So very sparingly adult hormone being used in growth hormone, that's what I'm advocate of, but I would like to get your perspective on this.
Thank you for your comments, really. One thing that the malpractices never has to be promoted. We should discourage that because that's wrong, and that's quackery. The other thing is about patients with the pituitary disorders. They do have growth hormone deficiency, as I told you, depending upon the number of pituitary hormone deficiencies they may already have. So we don't test for them, and that's why we are not picking it up. When I was in St. Bartholomew's Hospital in 1995, they were offering treatment, and it was in the practice also in UK that they used to do testings, and they're used. And this has been in use since 1990. In 1990s till today, adult growth hormone deficiency treatment. So it's an established treatment. It's not something a research tool at the moment, but we don't check it. And I also have to accept that I don't check it either at the moment. But I think I'm now convinced when I was preparing for this literature, for this talk, the literature, when I was reviewing, that it is something that I should be checking in my patients, the right patient, so that I can offer them treatment which will improve their quality of life and their other physical parameters that I have shown you. So that we should be doing it, but I think we need to be careful about who to treat, when to treat, and so these things have to be taken care of. But again, this is now an established treatment that is across the globe.
So the next question,
Yes.
Dr. Khadija. Sir, this.
Okay, thank you. Excellent talk. Just a comment about the long-acting growth hormone preparations. Now, they give me anxieties because a growth hormone basically has a mitogenic potential if you look at downstream the events there. And whenever we have such preparations which are there, we should always be watching out for the mitogenic complications which may occur. And to my mind, we do not have long-term studies yet.
Yes.
So yeah, so this is something we should be watching out, especially if we're going to give it to an age where already the effect of aging and senescence has led to an increased potential for mitogenesis. So we need to look into that.
Yes, I agree with you.
Yeah.
And I think it is available in only 3 parts of the world, in Korea, China, and US, and also been approved by Europe. Again, the use is very limited. The experience is very limited. So I think we need to wait and see, and it's not available in Pakistan anyway. But it is something that is very valid that you have said.
सर अस्सलाम वालेकुम सर, डॉक्टर मोहम्मद अरशद कहते हैं सर। सर मेरा सवाल ये है कि सर जैसे एक बच्ची आती है उसका हम बोन एज कराते हैं एक्सरे, और उसकी एज के मुताबिक उनका बोन एक्सरे आ जाता है, बोन एज। तो उसमें आप कहते हैं कि इसमें हम ग्रोथ हार्मोन नहीं देते, लेकिन मैं रियाज में मैंने काम किया, जद्दा में सर इंडोक्राइन डायबिटीज वहाँ पर दे रहे होते हैं सर।
देखिए, अगर डिपेंड्स कि आप किसके लिए दे रहे हैं। अगर आप शॉर्ट स्टेचर के लिए दे रहे हैं और उनकी एपिफिसिस क्लोज हो गई है तो हाइट तो नहीं ग्रो होगी ना। It will not happen. अगर वो दे रहे हैं तो that's wrong. We have to see why are they giving it. If they are giving it for short stature and the patient's epiphysis have closed, they are not going to gain any height. So it's wrong practice to give them growth hormone if their epiphysis have closed. Doctor, and you can make a comment on that because he was also from Saudi Arabia. So please comment on that.
Sir, my question is, hello, sir.
Excuse me, sir, I just want to clear that he wanted to ask about the bone age. Actually, it is not about the bone age. It is about the epiphyseal closure that sir is talking about. So if the epiphyses are closed, growth hormone cannot be given. But if the epiphyses are open, that can be offered. for a patient.
18 and onwards, females में जरा early close हो जाती है epiphysis as compared to males. But 18 onwards, even in males, there's hardly any potential for giving growth hormone for height purpose, stature purpose.
So next.
Sir, my name is Dr. Niaz. Sir, my question is, what's your, do you have data? Is dyslipidemia in a GH patient, growth hormone deficiency patient? Do you have any data?
I don't have my own data.
And second question is, nowadays prolong and continue use the quinolone. So quinolone, especially ciprofloxacin, is especially affect the growth hormone. And then how to prolong the growth hormone deficiency to continue the for next 1 year, 2 year, and how to prolong.
I didn't get your question. You said
I have two questions.
I don't have my own data. I have already told you that.
Yeah. First question. Now, second question is, do you have any data and experience in quinolone, especially ciprofloxacin, affect in children, continues and nowadays frequently used to affect the growth hormones? And second question is, growth hormone deficiency, continue treatment when will use how to prolong 1 year, 2 year, 3 year?
I said the last question I've already been answered really in my presentation, that mostly if it is going to be long term, that the period has not been defined, but mostly it is going to be lifelong if the patient benefits both biochemically as well as in the quality of life. So if you start the right patient and you start treatment and the patient is benefiting, we need to continue long term. That's the question. And as regards the interaction of quinolones with growth hormone treatment in childhood, the problem is that in my institution where I'm working, we don't see patients less than 18, and that is seen by pediatricians. So I cannot comment on your second question, the interaction of quinolones with growth hormone and my own experience, because I don't have any experience in this regard.
Dr. Najam, well presented. Probably what I get from his question is that fluoroquinolones supposedly have effect on chondroplasts and cause growth retardation, but they do not have any effect on growth hormone.
So not to my knowledge.
Assalamualaikum, sir. This is Dr. Khalil. I have a question, an academic question. We have a patient recently, a diagnosed case of IHHH, and she has a Tanner stage 2. And when we plotted her on a growth chart, she's below wet 3rd percentile. So again, we work for the anterior pituitary hormones, and it comes out with the TSH was normal and the cortisol was normal. And then we have went for IGF-1, it was below normal range. And then again, we went for IGF-1, that was normal, but below normal. And then we ran for the ITT. Surprising, all the growth hormone level, baseline 0, 30, and they were below 1 nanogram ml. Even she was not achieving a hypoglycemia of around 40 or 50, all her level around 60, 67. So my question is that she's right now having Tanner stage 2. Should we interpret repeat ITT after giving a priming dose like estrogen challenge test, or should we replace based on these results because she's all her growth hormone level less than 1 nanogram?
I mean, as I can understand from your question, that probably she has multiple deficiencies. One deficiency, and the IGF level is low. And the ITTs really have not been able to interpret because she did not go into hypoglycemia. So I think if she was she given the right dose, maybe you have to repeat it with a higher dose of.
She received 2 doses of the insulin as reported in the lab.
So priming is sometimes recommended, but not everybody believes in priming. But yes, you can do a repeat testing after priming the patient.
Assalamualaikum, sir.
Khurshid Sahab, please, sir.
Thank you. Actually, I agree with Dr. Khurshid. Actually, you know, we do come across many cases who have got they have got the pituitary tumors, and they do get, and post-operative and pre-operative also, when we assess, they have got like they're hypopit, you know, with pituitary hormone deficiencies. And even after surgery, if we replace them with the steroids and the sex steroid, and they feel normal and they are working and everything, you know. So although their IGF-1 is low in these cases, but is it indicated to give growth hormone in these cases, you know, when
this is what I've shown, this is what my lecture was all about.
Yeah.
Trying to convince everybody that it is an established entity and we need to think about it. And it's
but clinically, you know, we do come across cases who are doing fine, you know, without.
But I mean,
adults.
I was really a bit reluctant to do it just because of the cost. But when I really dig into this, and I found out that the cost is anything between 7,000 to 21,000. So we can offer this treatment to selected group of patients who can afford it, really, but not to everybody. But again,
can I just endorse what Dr. Najam is saying? We are endocrinologists, and we are in the business of replacing hormones. We cannot deny the efficacy of replacing growth hormone. There's evidence for it in people who are deficient. Having said that, we all have patients like that. And, you know, the expense of replacement, 7 to 21,000 is not prohibitive for many people. You know, we need to be aware of this. We can't just say they're doing fine on sex steroids and cortisol, but you don't know how much finer they're going to be if you were to replace their growth hormone. But if you can see that that expense is prohibitive for this patient, I wouldn't even initiate that discussion, let alone
Yes, that
test.
is very important. If
Yeah.
you have desire to treat, then only do the testings, otherwise no point.
Thank you so much, Professor Dr. Najam. Thank you. The section is going to be ended. Thank you so much. Sorry.
फर्क आ गया सर। हमने उनको 6 महीने तक ग्रोथ हार्मोन दिया, लेकिन सर बहुत सारे पेशेंट का जो है वो एज नहीं बढ़ती, तो हम क्या करें सर? उसको कंटिन्यू करें?
नहीं, आप एज क्या है उसकी?
10 साल है, 8 साल है सर।
हाँ, 10 साल है और आपने ग्रोथ हार्मोन डेफिशिएंसी स्टैब्लिश कर लिया
जी,
और आपने ग्रोथ हार्मोन रिप्लेसमेंट दिया
जी,
और हाइट नहीं बढ़ी
जी,
तो आप उसकी सारी जो मॉनिटरिंग IGF-1 वगैरह लेवल्स वगैरह आपने देखा, उसकी डोज इंक्रीज करके देखी, अगर आपने सब कुछ किया उसके बावजूद उसकी हाइट नहीं बढ़ रही है, तो दैट मींस यू नीड टू डिसकंटिन्यू द ट्रीटमेंट।
कंटिन्यू सर,
डिसकंटिन्यू।
डिसकंटिन्यू।
देयर इज नो पॉइंट गिविंग
और
अ
अगर हम
ट्रीटमेंट,
देंगे तो कितना वक्त दें और सर उसको?
देयर इज नो पॉइंट गिविंग अ ट्रीटमेंट व्हिच डज नॉट वर्क।
Thank you so much.
मुतबादिल क्या है सर?
Thank you so much, sir. Thank you. All the other candidates can ask the questions to Professor Najam after the session, please. So we have to, I would now request the chairs, Professor Dr. Taseem Ehsan, to give some brief, valuable comments about the session.
Thank you very much, Dr. Shella, for conducting this beautifully. I must thank the presenters, Dr. Saeed Meher, Dr. Umar Raja, and Professor Najmul Islam for their eloquent and very composite presentations on issues that are very topical and very contentious at times. And this has been a great update for all of us. I've thoroughly enjoyed this session. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, ma'am. Now I would request Professor Rauf Niazi to kindly give some brief, valuable comments.
I don't think, Alhamdulillah, I'm really proud to be sitting here, being an executive member of, honorary executive member of Pakistan Endocrine Society. And let me congratulate the people who started all this. My postgraduate trainees at Pakistan Institute of Medical Sciences all wanted to come to this conference. It was so popular that they wanted to be in this conference. So my congratulations to the founder members and the people who've been carrying on with this society. They've made into a forum and a society which is not only recognized in Pakistan, but people are talking about in abroad as well. So all the lectures were beautifully conducted with their very experienced wise speakers. And I found the audience, all of them being very attentive, and could see the enthusiasm in them in asking questions and paying attention to the lectures. So I really enjoyed them. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure and an honor to be with all of you.
Thank you so much, sir. So now I would request consultant endocrinologist, our very senior colleague and a past president of Pakistan Endocrine Society, Professor Dr. A.H. Amir from KPK chapter. So sir, kindly come on the stage and award the cheers of appreciation to the speakers and the chairs. So first of all, I would request Dr. Umar Yusuf Raja, who was having the first talk, kindly come on the stage and receive your. So now I would request Professor Dr. Najmul Islam. So sir, kindly come on the stage and receive your certificate of appreciation and shield. Thank you, sir. Now I will request Professor Dr. Taseem Ehsan. Ma'am, kindly come forward and receive your shield of appreciation. So I would request Professor Rauf Niazi, sir, kindly come forward. And lastly, I would request myself to stay on the stage and receive the certificate of appreciation from Sir A.H. Ahmed.